All right, so this lecture is going to be about drugs and specifically about drug-altered states of consciousness. We're going to start off by going through a couple of major kind of terms associated with drug use, and then we will talk about specific types of drugs as well. Okay, so the first kind of definition to realize is what makes a drug a psychoactive drug. What makes a drug more than just aspirin? What makes a drug something that we would want to study in psychology? So we will define a drug as any chemical substance that could alter perception and or mood. So anything from prescription drugs like Vicodin or oxycodone or anything along those lines absolutely fits. But then, of course, we could be talking about heroin. We could be talking about cocaine and meth. We could be talking about marijuana. We could be talking about ecstasy. So, or even nicotine, caffeine. So there's a huge range of basically substances that fit the definition of what we would call a psychoactive drug. Now, when you talk about drugs, people usually will talk about something like an addiction. How do you become addicted to a drug? Can you become addicted to a drug? And so on. Within research on addiction, though, there are really two types of dependency that you can get. You can become what's called physically dependent to a drug. And this is where you actually have a physiological, meaning it comes from like your biology. Your body craves the drug. Your body needs the drug. And this is typically shown when someone doesn't have the drug, they go through some really bad withdrawals. So, for example, an alcoholic, once they stop drinking, they sometimes have the shakes. You'll see like a crash, like a physical crash from a cocaine addict. With heroin, you see something similar, and so on. A lot of pain associated with heroin. So, physically, your body becomes addicted to the substance and it needs it more. We've even seen some cases where the actual organs, the tissue inside the organs changes because the person is taking all these foreign substances. They're taking this drug. And so the body's own tissue changes to adjust for that drug use. The problem is when the person stops, now their body can't function normally because it's changed. And so you start to see these really bad withdrawals. The other type of dependence we could talk about is what's called psychological dependence. And so this would be a psychological need to use the drug. Maybe you use the drug because you're sad and you know that this will help you. Maybe it's that you feel some stress and so you want to relieve your anxiety. It's not necessarily a physical craving more than like a mental craving. After a long day at work, if you come home and you want a glass of wine or a beer or to have a cigarette or whatever it might be to help you calm down, that's more of a psychological dependence. Both of these can lead to addiction. What are some other terms that go along with dependence and addiction? Well, the big one is what is called tolerance. So tolerance is the idea that with every dose of the drug that you take, it does less and less and less to your body. So you can see the line in the graph here, right? The first time the animal takes the dose, they have a big response to it. But after repeated exposure, they have less and less of a response to it, so the animal needs to take more and more and more of the drug. Thus the line is moving. You can imagine a case where a student takes, let's say, something like methamphetamines, at the beginning of a very busy week, and the following week decides to take them again because their first week went really well, so they take some more like amphetamines, meth, something along those lines. And then the next week, the same thing. And then the next week, the same thing. And eventually, your body starts to realize what's coming, especially if you start taking the drug around similar people or in a similar place or at a similar time. Remember classical conditioning, right? Your body eventually starts learning to associate all of these things with that drug. So if we take something like methamphetamine, right? Meth is going to increase your heart rate, it's going to increase your breathing, right? It brings all these things up. Well, your body wants them all to be at a normal level. And so what's going to happen is your body, after you take the drug and your heart rate goes way high, your body's going to do what it can to bring your heart rate down. Well, let's say you keep taking this drug at the same time, in the same place, around the same people for 3 or 4 weeks straight. Your body quickly learns, oh, okay, there's those people that we normally take this drug with. It's about that time. And oh, we're in this environment that I'm used to taking this drug with. So your body learns when the drug is coming. And so what your body will do is actually try and prepare for the drug, counteract it, if you will. So even though meth is going to raise your heart rate, once your body starts to see it coming, once your body starts to realize that the meth is coming, your body's going to actually drop your heart rate before you take the drug. And now, when you take your meth, your heart rate doesn't go quite as high because your body had dropped it originally. So now, what do you need? You need more. And that's tolerance, this idea that your body actually tries to counteract the drug when it knows it's coming. It tries to counteract the effects of the drug. And so the user then needs to take more and more and more and more. Now, what happens in this situation if the user decides to stop using? Well, the body doesn't know that the user is going to stop using. So the user then sees those friends or goes to the environment where they're used to taking this drug, and the body then drops the heart rate. This is what's called withdrawal. So this is the discomfort, the distress that follows when you stop using. Realize that withdrawals and tolerance are essentially the flip side of the exact same coin. Tolerance is when your body kind of counteracts what the drug is doing so that you need to take more, right, to try and protect itself. The body does this. Withdrawals, the body tries to counteract the effects of the drug, so it drops your heart rate, but then you don't take the drug because you've chosen to try and quit. And when you have that like lower heart rate, or you have that countering that the body is doing, it doesn't feel very good. And so that's the withdrawals. When we talk about actual drugs themselves, there are 3 main groups of drugs. The first one are called the depressants, and so these are drugs that are going to slow things down, that slow down neural activity, they slow down your heart rate, they slow down your breathing, and the big kind of groups of this are alcohol, that's the big one of course, but things like barbiturates or benzodiazepines, so like your anxiety medicines, Xanax, Valium, those types of things, and then opiates, so your Vicodin, your Oxy, your morphine, your heroin, your codeine, all of those things fit into that category of a depressant. The next category is what's called the stimulant, and the stimulant is basically the opposite of the depressant. So these are going to increase neural activity, excite neural activity, bring your heart rate up, bring your breathing rate up, so speeds everything up, blood pressure, all of that. And these are drugs like caffeine, nicotine, amphetamines, cocaine, and so on. A lot of people are surprised to see nicotine on there because, in fact, most people, you think of someone who has a cigarette, maybe they're a little jittery, and then they have a cigarette, and the cigarette kind of calms them down. But realize what has actually happened there is a little bit of that tolerance we've been talking about before. When does someone get jittery for a cigarette? Well, when they haven't had one for a while. So the body's starting to go through maybe some withdrawals, something like that. And so by having the cigarette, they're actually kind of bringing their heart rate back to normal. They're kind of just raising things back up kind of around normal instead of having it be too low. And that makes them get more relaxed. The third category of psychoactive drugs are the hallucinogenic substances. And so these are not really taken for the physical side of things, but these are drugs that are taken more for the mind altering, the perceptual types of, changes that can happen. So the big one is something like LSD, acid, but ecstasy also sometimes gets thrown into this group. Marijuana is probably the most well-known of the hallucinogens. In large doses, marijuana is absolutely a hallucinogenic substance. Let's talk about some specific drugs. First group I want to mention are the barbiturates. These are depressants, and these are drugs that are going to be taken typically for anxiety, maybe to help you sleep. Some barbiturates are given for like surgery to like knock the person out. So these are going to slow down everything going on in your body. They also impair memory. They can, definitely impair your judgment. So driving under the influence means a lot more than just alcohol nowadays. The thing about barbiturates is they have largely been replaced by a safer group of drugs called benzodiazepines, of which you get like a Xanax, Valium, those types of medications. Um, but they're fairly comparable. Benzodiazepines are just a safer form of barbiturates, but they kind of do similar things. They reduce anxiety, they depress the central nervous system, they impair memory and judgment as well. The next depressant I want to mention are what you see in the picture here. These are poppies, and so poppies, so these aren't the little California pretty poppies, right? These are these really ugly kind of bulbs that grow, and you kind of scrape out the insides, boil it down, and this is how you get opium, which then can be turned into all sorts of different opioids and opiates. Opium in its pure form gives you things like morphine and codeine. But if you add all sorts of stuff to it, you can come up with heroin or Vicodin or Oxy and various things like that. As a general rule, these types of medications are taken for pain, and they are, though, depressants. So they're going to depress brain activity, lessen pain, help someone sleep, lessen anxiety, things along those lines. What about the stimulants category? So you'll see things like cocaine discussed in the book. The one I want to highlight are amphetamines. And when someone says an amphetamine, that doesn't always mean methamphetamine. Meth is one type of amphetamine. Amphetamines can be things like Ritalin, Adderall, those types of drugs too. Fen-phen, which was popular about 10-15 years ago for like dieting. So diet pills a lot of times could be types of amphetamines. And what these do is they're going to stimulate all the neural activity. They're going to speed up your body's functions, which is why they work pretty well for diet pills, because they increase your metabolism, so you burn through a lot of your calories. It absolutely gives the person more energy and typically boosts their mood, makes them happier, at least temporarily while they are high. You do see a lot of times a major crash after going on amphetamines, though. So you got to be careful how someone comes off of that. The third category, you can see kind of my psychedelic move there, is the hallucinogen category. And so the big three hallucinogens that I want to at least kind of discuss are ecstasy. And so ecstasy, also known as MDMA, is actually both a stimulant and a hallucinogen, so it works both ways. And ecstasy is not as safe as a lot of people think it is. The biggest risk with ecstasy is when someone buys it, which is frequently at a rave. You never know what you're getting. So there was one study that went to where they went to raves and they bought everything that they could that was being marketed as ecstasy. And then they went to their lab and they analyzed what they actually had bought. And for every 5 pills that were marketed as ecstasy, only one of them was pure ecstasy. And then of the remaining 4 out of 5, only one of those even had ecstasy in it. The other 3 didn't have any ecstasy at all in it. They found things like rat poison, antifreeze, all sorts of poisons, essentially, that the person was taking. And of course, poisons will lead to sometimes these kinds of mind-altering psychoactive things as well. Most drugs have negative things like that associated with them. Whether ecstasy itself, pure ecstasy, is dangerous is kind of a loaded question. There are many people that say it's not, and there are many people that say that it is. It seems like there's definitely some danger with it. It has one of the highest first-time user death or hospitalization rates associated with it. So some people are definitely prone to bad reactions to ecstasy. Others don't seem to be. I'll show you a picture in a couple of slides here of what it does to your brain, though. So then you can conclude whether it has any health risk. The next psychoactive hallucinogenic drug to discuss is LSD, also known as acid. LSD is notable because it is the one of the drugs that is mentioned here that does not seem to impact your dopamine system. Now, dopamine makes you feel good. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that impacts pleasure, that increases pleasure. So if LSD does not seem to increase pleasure, it kind of stands out because it's the one drug that we've never seen an addiction to, at least not a physical or even much of a psychological addiction. This is not an advertisement for LSD. Please don't say my psych teacher said. It's safe, go for it. LSD is actually still pretty dangerous. It typically isn't going to slow down your heart rate the way, let's say, heroin would, where you could die that way. And it's not going to raise your blood pressure to dangerous levels the way cocaine or methamphetamine can. The most dangerous thing about LSD is the stupid stuff people do while they are on LSD. So if you are having a bad trip, sometimes people think they're being persecuted, so they get a gun and they start shooting someone. They think they can fly, so they jump off of roofs and end up hurting themselves. There are all sorts of really stupid things that people do while high on LSD. So it is kind of known that the LSD probably won't kill you, although you do have to be very careful with how much of it you take. But the stupid things people do while high on LSD can absolutely kill you. And you do want to be careful because there's even a form of like a post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD that can happen because of a bad LSD trip. Remember, you're not in control of the trip itself, of what happens to you while you're hallucinating. And so that could go positive ways or it could go negative ways. And so you just want to be careful. The third one to address is THC. And THC is the main active ingredient in marijuana. Marijuana just this last month became legal for recreational use in California, and it's now 3 other states as well has it legal for recreational use. Marijuana can help with pain, like there are plenty of medicinal purposes for marijuana, but it is still a drug. Does have some negative side effects. So, for example, there are withdrawals associated from marijuana use. It does release dopamine, which leads us to conclude that there is some sort of addiction to marijuana. Most people, though, have found that if there is an addiction, and there does seem to be, it's less addictive than caffeine. So it's not very addictive, but there does seem to be some sort of addiction to it. Marijuana has been linked to causing cancer. There have been many, many, many studies that have been done that has found a link between marijuana smoking and lung cancer. There have been other studies, though, that have claimed that marijuana use can, in fact, cure cancer. Those are not quite as well accepted in the scientific community. They don't have as much support. It depends on the type of cancer. Marijuana use does seem to help people who are having like chemotherapy treatments if they have cancer, because marijuana has been known to stimulate hunger, a la the munchies. So that can help someone who is otherwise nauseous. So there are definitely some benefits to marijuana use, but there does seem to be a lot of negatives to go along with it, especially in teenagers and young adults. It seems like when the brain is still developing, so prior to the age of maybe 21, 22, 23, maybe even up to 25, there have been studies that have found alterations in brain development that have been linked to marijuana use. So it is not as safe as maybe people wish it to be. So the last few slides here, I just want to show you a few pictures of the brain. My background is brain imaging. All of my research was taking pictures of the brain. I didn't do any drug imaging studies, but there are plenty of them out there, and so I wanted to throw these in just as a little extra. What you can see here is that, first off, this is a top view of 3 different brains. And across the top row, what you're looking at are subjects doing a task when they had no caffeine in their system. And then in the bottom row, those are the same 3 subjects doing the same task, but now they had some caffeine, and it was the equivalent of about 2 cups of coffee. Notice there are some pretty big changes here. There's a lot more brain activity after taking caffeine, roughly 6 to 7 times the amount of brain activity. Now, what does this actually mean? We don't know. I'm not here to say caffeine is bad, stop drinking your coffee, but by the same token, realize that even something as accepted and as universal and maybe as thought of as very benign as caffeine absolutely impacts your nervous system and your brain and has some impact. So, what are the long term effects of that? Are there things that it's doing to us that maybe we don't fully understand? It could be. That said, I still have my coffee daily. This is probably my favorite picture that I show in Intro to Psych. This was a study that was done looking at MDMA, which is ecstasy. And what they did in this study is they just looked at people who either admittedly had never had ecstasy before, or they looked at people who were regular users of ecstasy. And by regular use, they defined it somewhere around once a week for about 9 months. So they admitted to using ecstasy about once a week over the course of 9 months. Now, what you're looking at here in the top kind of half is these are all pictures of the same brain, but they're basically slices. And so if you look at the one that's maybe the third row down all the way on the right, that is the topmost slice of the brain. And then as you move to the left, and then as you start moving up, it goes from the very top of the brain kind of down a little bit, down a little more, down a little more, down a little bit more. When you're on the second row, you're in the middle of the brain. And by the time you get to the first row, the top row, you're at the bottom of the brain. And all of these slices are looking from above. So you're looking at the brain from above. So this is basically one brain here, and the top are the ones that have never had ecstasy before. On the bottom, you're looking at the same kind of slices, but these are from people who admitted to regular use of ecstasy over a 9-month period. Now, what they did in this study is they know that ecstasy targets serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter linked to depression, linked to sleep, insomnia, all sorts of things like that. And so what they did is they actually labeled the serotonin receptors. So not the serotonin, but the actual receptors. So this is the things that the serotonin goes and binds to. And they were able to label them with something that would show up on this picture as a white dot. So notice in the top group of brains, the ones that have never had ecstasy before, you see white dots kind of spread out throughout. There's a lot of like kind of little white bright spots in this brain. And so that shows us that serotonin receptors kind of naturally are all over our brain. Look at the MDMA or the ecstasy user now. And what you see down there is maybe 2, maybe 3 slices of brain that have any serotonin receptors left. All the rest of the receptors have either been destroyed by ecstasy or are just no longer working. Now, what does that mean? Well, long term, ecstasy use has absolutely been linked to depression. If you don't have any serotonin receptors, then when you release your serotonin, nothing happens. So it doesn't make you feel happy anymore the way it should. The other thing to come from this is if you think about how do we treat depression, well, the number one treatment for depression is you give someone an antidepressant like Prozac. Well, what Prozac does is it makes you basically have more serotonin available. Having more serotonin isn't going to do anyone any good who's an ecstasy addict, because it's not about the serotonin, it's about the serotonin receptor, and they don't have any receptors. So you can increase all the serotonin you want, you can take all the Prozac you want, it absolutely will not help the ecstasy user. What about marijuana? Well, here is a PET study. So PET, it looks at blood flow. And so this is looking at a marijuana user and someone who has never had marijuana before. So across the top, again, it's kind of like the last slide that you were looking at. We've got kind of 4 slices. All 4 are taken from above the brain, looking down onto the brain. But the one all the way on the left is kind of at the top. And then you move to the middle, and then you move down. So we're moving kind of from the top to the bottom of the brain as we go across this slide. The main key here is to notice that as you compare the non-marijuana user to the marijuana abuser, we see a lot less brain activity when someone has basically smoked a lot of pot. This is in fact something we see across many addictions. So in this slide, we've got it for a cocaine user, we've got it for an alcoholic, we've got it for someone who's obese, so they were a food addict, we've got it for someone who was a tobacco smoker. And they were doing slightly different things in all of these studies, and that's why you don't see the exact same brain activity across them all. But notice that the addicts, as a rule, have less brain activity than the non-addicts. And that holds true for marijuana too. So again, more evidence that marijuana can lead to addictions in every way possible. This concludes the drugs lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know.